They looked like they might be visitors from another time, a much earlier time. Walter had this long, full gray beard and tangled gray hair, and he wore this dark hat with the brim. He wore a dark, heavy wool coat that came down almost to his knees. He was kind of hunched over, dark pants, boots. He looked ancient. He probably was about as old as I am now. His daughter, Elsie, wore these long dresses that brushed the ground. They were dark-colored, plain. She wore her dark hair tied up in a bun, tight, and she would wear a hat or some sort of bonnet that obscured her face. She wore little wire-rimmed glasses. They were seldom seen and even less often heard. In a little town, a tiny little town of 300 and some people that had more than its share of oddballs and misfits, those two still stood out. They stood out to the extent that they really didn't fit in anywhere. It was like they did not belong in that place in that time. There are people like that. Without doing anything, they just are that way. They don't even try. And there are things like that that are, in a sense, timeless. So, teacher, the lawyer asks, of all of the requirements, the commandments in the law, and there's 613 of them, of all of those, which one stands out to you as the most important one? It's a question that is to test Jesus, to see if he really knows his stuff, like he seems to, like he pretends to, and maybe to find out if can they work with him. Is he open to cooperating, listening, exchange, or is he some crazy that they have to contain or send packing? His response is so direct, it's almost shocking. He says the most important commandment is to love God with your whole self, your whole being, your mind, your heart, your strength, your soul, to love God with your entire being, not holding back. That's the core of it. That's where it starts, he says. And the Pharisees, who are asking the questions and discussing him, they're nodding, saying, oh, maybe we're kind of worked up over nothing. This guy seems okay. He's right on track, because that's the Shema, the beginning of the Shema, the statement that every faithful Jew is supposed to recite the beginning of every day. But then Jesus says, but it only starts there. It doesn't end there. That love of God that takes your whole self, that you pour your whole self into, that's got to overflow then into love of neighbor. It has to become love of neighbor as yourself, because then it becomes that one love that comes back around and it's whole. That's where life happens. That's where it is. Now that would have been enough. Bringing those two pieces of the Hebrew Scripture together in that way, unlike anybody else had before, that would have been enough to set off a wonderful debate amongst these talkers, these thinkers, these gentlemen who are there to discuss things. And it might have been the thing that opened the door to Jesus to step in and join the debating society that the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees all participate in. He might have been in if he'd wanted to be. He might have fit in. But the story of Jesus that Matthew tells us, that the Gospels tell us, is not the story of someone who's trying to fit in to things as they are. So Jesus then, while their ears are open and they seem to be leaning in towards him, asks them a question. He says, so tell me about the Messiah. What do you think? Whose son is the Messiah, the Christ? And they said, well, he would be the son of David, because the promise is that there would be someone on the throne of David forever and ever. God promises that. And so the one God sends would have to be in that line, would be David's son, David's descendant. And Jesus says, well, if that's the case, then why does David, presumed to be the author of the Psalms at that time, why does David say, God said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I'll put your enemies under your feet? If David addresses the Messiah as Lord, then how can he be David's son? How can the son be beneath the father? Because the glory of the father is what the son inherits, right? So how can that be? It's sort of a convoluted, confusing spin, and it's meant to be. Jesus wants to throw them off, wants to show them that they really don't know everything. And I think what he's really doing is saying that the mission of the Messiah, the one that God sends, is not to be a Davidic king who's going to make Israel great again. That's not the thing that the Messiah comes to do. The mission of the one God sends, the mission of Christ, is way larger and deeper than that. And it is to call God's people to live this love of God that was just articulated, love of God that becomes love of neighbor as self-loving in that whole one way. Because that's where the kingdom happens. That's where the transformation occurs. That's when things change dramatically. When that one love takes hold and flows freely. So what does it take for that to happen? What does that require? Have you ever seen it? It was about this time of year that little Methodist church would serve their fall turkey dinner. It was the old-style church basement dinner that most of us are familiar with. It used to be very common, and now are rather rare, and now probably they're non-existent this year. In the fall, early November, after harvest, right in there, and everybody in this little church would participate, from the youngest to the oldest. There would be people in the kitchen cooking and brewing coffee and doing dishes and dishing up food and hauling it out and putting it on the tables, and people cutting pies and putting pieces of pie out. In the corner Sunday school room in this church basement, there's about 6 guys around a big table, and they're all carving turkeys, and they do that all evening. They're sending out platters of freshly carved roasted turkey all evening. Upstairs, there's a small team of people who are welcoming the guests who are coming in and showing them where to put their coats if it's coat weather, and ushering them upstairs. And if they need to buy a ticket, they can buy a ticket there. They come into the sanctuary and they sit and wait until their number is called on their ticket. And somebody is running up and down the stairs watching the progress when people leave and tables are reset. Then you count how many you can send down, and you go up and figure that out and count that number and call it out. Numbers 210 through 232 can come down. Now there's room for you. And they get up and file out. That's the way it works all evening. And it's busy, and it's warm, and it's noisy. And the windows in the basement are fogged up because of all the people and all the cooking, and the smells are wonderful. It's just one of those traditional church basement dinners. But this time, guess who shows up? Who never come before, who've never been there before? Walter and Elsie are there. It's like they just appear. They're sitting at one of the long tables, the one closest to the west wall. And they're sitting there dressed like they just came out of the sod hut on the prairie. And they're sitting there like they belong there, which they don't, because they never come. They're never there. They're not out in society. They're not out in the community at all, ever. You hardly ever see them, but here they are. What are they doing? What are they doing here? What's going on? And they sit down and the food comes and they sit and eat in silence because that's the way they are, acting like it's just another day and this is just what they do, but it's not. And they're surrounded by these people who come to this event all the time, every fall. It's a traditional thing. You mark your calendar by when this church has its dinner and this church has its dinner, and, that's the way it works. But they're sitting near Walter and Elsie, and they're giving them as much room as they possibly can, physically distancing themselves because they're wary of these people. They don't know these people. These are strange-looking people. Walter and Elsie sit and eat. There's no commotion. And they finish, and they get up, and they leave. They just disappear without a word, without a sound. And everybody around them goes, whew, and they relax, and they engage in conversation like they normally would. It had all been kind of restrained and constrained. Well, after everybody has eaten, and the guests, the diners are all gone, and the church folks who are doing the work and serving and cleaning up, they're the only ones left, and so they take a break, and they cluster in little groups around in the basement, and they'll maybe have a bite to eat. Pie, you start with pie because there's not a lot of that left, and so you go and find the best piece of pie you can and get that taken care of, maybe with a little coffee, and then you get into the other stuff if there's any of that left. And they talk while they're there, about, how'd it go, and what did we run out of? And what was good this year, and that was a little off, or it was a little mushy, or it was a little tasteless this year. The squash was kind of blah. Maybe we should do something else. The way kind of revisit and debrief. And talking about who was there and who wasn't there, and who you expect to see and who you didn't see. And, oh yeah, they're gone, or oh yeah, they died, or he died. They're chattering away, and this one group that my dad is part of, because he was in carving the turkeys, my brother John approaches them. Now, my brother John, I'm the youngest, John is the middle, Joel is the next oldest, and then my sister Sue is the oldest. John is a special needs person. He will be 68 in November, but his mental age sort of got stuck at about 9 or 10. So he's an older brother who's like a little kid. And he knows he's different. He stands out, and he understands that. In some way, he knows it. But in this church, he is gathered in because he's part of our family. He knows he's different, but he belongs. And he recognizes other people who are different and who stand out. He can pick them out right now. And he approaches this group of adults who are chattering and drinking coffee and laughing. And he says, Dad, did you see who was here tonight? Did you see who came? Walter and Elsie came tonight. Did you see them? They were sitting right over there. Did you see them, Dad? Walter and Elsie came to have dinner with us at our church tonight. Isn't that good? Isn't that good, Dad? You know what? He goes on, we should do this all the time. We should do this all the time so that Walter and Elsie could come all the time here, just like we do. Wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't that be good? And John doesn't even wait for a response. He doesn't need one because he knows he's right. He knows that's the truth. And he knows that's what should happen. There should be a dinner like this, a meal like this every week so Walter and Elsie could come. He knows what it takes for those who stand out to come inside, to be included. He understands that. And so he walks off cheerful because he's got it figured out. And he understands what needs to happen and should happen. As he leaves, that group of adults is silent because they know that he's right too. And they also know that what's needed is not going to happen. It's impossible. They can't do it. And frankly, they're not sure that if they could, they even want to, if they're honest. After the exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, it was quiet too. Everybody knew, after Jesus spoke, what needed to happen. And that it was too much. And that it wouldn't happen. Everybody but Jesus, you see, because he's committed to that. His life is given to that. Love God with your whole self. No holding back. However you're called to do that, whatever the situation, do that so that you can't stop yourself from loving your neighbor, the other, as yourself. So that the distance between you and him, you and her, you and them disappears. So that there's no such thing as other, there's only us. I think that's what it means to be a Christian. Whatever your beliefs are, I think that's what Jesus calls us to do. Now, I sometimes joke that I am a follower of Jesus, but not very closely, because that can get you into trouble. We know what happened to him. Following Jesus too closely can get you into trouble. That good kind of trouble that John Lewis talked about, the kind that takes in everyone and everything, that is all gathered up into one, into the one, and all changed and all made new, including you and me. Amen.